Imagine marching 20 miles a day under a blistering sun, with your uniform torn to shreds, your canteen nearly empty, and the constant threat of disease, ambush, or starvation hanging over you. This was the daily reality of American infantry soldiers during the Mexican-American War. They were fighting exhaustion, hunger, and death itself. Yet, over the course of almost 2 long years, American infantrymen, both regular soldiers and volunteers, would march hundreds of miles, storm fortified cities, fight in deserts, mountains, and jungles, and eventually raise the American flag over the heart of Mexico City. When the US Congress declared war on Mexico in 1846, the American army was small, untested, and in many ways unprepared for a long campaign deep in foreign territory. This left the United States with a little more than a skeleton army at the very moment it was called to invade a foreign land. Congress ordered the army to expand its ranks as quickly as possible. Infantry regiments backed by artillery and dragoons formed the backbone of the force, but even when combined, they were far too small to carry an invasion deep into Mexico. To make up the difference, the states stepped in, raising volunteer regiments by the dozen and sending them south to join the campaign. The War Department itself was tiny, run by Secretary William H. Marcy with just 9 clerks and 2 messengers. Organized along European lines, the standing US Army, designated Regular Army, contained a specialized corps of infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers. In compliance with its missions of guarding the frontier and defending the nation's coastline, the Army had scattered its units in a small post manned by units of company size or less across the eastern seaboard and throughout the interior frontier. Army divisions were only built as temporary wartime organizations, made up of a few brigades, while each brigade in turn contained multiple regiments. Because entire regiments rarely assemble in peacetime, the Army had little opportunity to practice large-scale unit tactics. On paper, a regiment was supposed to number around 1,000 men. But in reality, disease, desertion, and attrition reduced their strength dramatically. Most regiments enter battle at half their authorized size, or even less. Before the war started, the US Army was officially authorized at 8,613 men across 14 regiments, 8 infantry, 4 artillery, and 2 dragoons. But cost-cutting measures had reduced company sizes, so the real number was closer to 7,883 men. A typical infantry regiment had around 28 officers and 400 to 450 enlisted men. For example, the 3rd Infantry at Corpus Christi in early 1846 had a total strength of 511 men. The regular infantrymen in the American Army enlisted for 5 years and received an average pay of $7 per month. Offering low wages and harsh discipline, the service attracted the poorly educated and those with few opportunities in civilian life. In 1845, 42% of the army consisted of foreign nationals. Half of them were Irish, and the rest were from other European nations. The average American volunteer soldier of the Mexican-American War was often a young man in his late teens or 20s, drawn from farms, small towns, or rough frontier communities. But the question is, why did so many young Americans volunteer to fight in the Mexican-American War? For some, it was patriotism, a chance to defend their country and prove their honor. Others were inspired by manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. Many sought adventures, eager to escape the routine of farm life and see foreign lands, while others were lured by the pay, promises of land bounties, or simply the chance to start fresh. Not every motive was noble. Some joined to escape debts as a result of failed crops, or some were just unhappy with family life. Others wanted to impress women or elevate their social standing. and others were simply swept by peer pressure when friends or neighbors enlisted. Ethnic groups like Irish, German, and other recently immigrated men joined to prove their loyalty to their new country. Meanwhile, Texans in particular volunteered in large numbers, motivated by old grievances with Mexico after the Texas Revolution and the memory of the Alamo. By war's end, 115,000 Americans had served, but only about 13,000 were regulars. The rest were volunteers, men who elected their officers, brought their own energy and courage, but often lacked training and discipline. U.S. Army's regular infantry wore a uniform that reflected both Napoleonic tradition and frontier practicality. The standard uniform included a dark blue frock coat with sky blue trousers and white cross belts, which carried the bayonet scabbard and a cartridge box. On campaign, however, soldiers often wore a shorter fatigue jacket of light blue wool that was more comfortable in the heat. The most distinctive feature was a forage cap, a small dark blue cap with a short leather visor, though some units still retained the tall, awkward shakos early in the war. Officers' uniforms were more ornate, with dark blue coats, gilt buttons, and epaulettes marking rank. But the volunteers, they were a different sight altogether. Volunteers did not receive army uniforms. Some wore gray or brown militia coats, others all hunting shirts, and many marched off in civilian clothes. Hats ranged from slouch hats to broad-brimmed sombreros purchased in Mexican markets. The American volunteer looked less like a professional soldier and more like an armed civilian, poorly equipped but fiercely determined. Although the War Department ordered the production of percussion-cap muskets during the war with Mexico, at the outset of the conflict, the predominant infantry weapon was the flintlock smoothbore musket. The most common models were the Model 1816 and the Model 1842. These .69 caliber muskets were slow to operate and inaccurate by modern standards, but when fired in volleys, they were devastating. Their effective range was maybe 50 to 100 yards, but beyond that, you were lucky to hit anything. But the Americans held two key advantages over their Mexican opponents: better quality gunpowder and the deadly buck and ball ammunition, a single musket ball backed by 3 buckshot pellets. Firing volleys, this turned every musket into a miniature shotgun, shredding enemy ranks at close range. Aside from his musket, the typical infantryman carried a bayonet strapped to his belt, ready for use in close combat. The American soldiers had a canteen for water, though it was often lukewarm or contaminated, and a simple cloth haversack that held his daily rations. On his back, he bore a heavy knapsack, stuffed with the bare essentials: a wool blanket, an extra shirt, and whatever few personal belongings he could manage to bring from home. Together, this gear weighed dozens of pounds. Regular soldiers were trained in strict European-style discipline. Under officers influenced by West Point, they drilled daily in marching, close order formations, and firing volleys with smoothbore muskets, focusing on collective firepower rather than individual marksmanship. They practiced bayonet charges, duty guard, and strict routines in camp, with harsh punishments for disobedience. This training made them steady under fire and reliable in battle. However, once in Mexico, they had to adapt beyond their formal drill, learning skirmishing and urban combat tactics. The volunteers, on the other hand, were often enthusiastic but chaotic. Many had never fired a musket in formation before battle. They elected their officers, and sometimes discipline broke down. Some regiments fought bravely to the last, while others broke and ran under pressure. This duality would haunt American commanders throughout the war: how to balance the steadiness of regulars with the unpredictability of volunteers. Most American volunteers in the Mexican-American War enlisted for 12 months of service. That was the standard term authorized by Congress in 1846. When the war dragged on longer than expected, some volunteer regiments' terms expired right in the middle of the conflict, forcing them to go home even as new units were raised to replace them. In some cases, volunteers were asked or pressured to re-enlist for an additional year, but many refused, tired of disease, poor conditions, and long marches. A few states also raised volunteer units for shorter terms, like 6 months, though these were less common. Let's step into the shoes of an American infantry soldier to see what daily life was really like. During the Mexican-American War, most of their time was spent not fighting but marching, waiting and suffering. Every soldier in Mexico remembered the marches, long, punishing journeys of 15 to 25 miles a day, under a blistering sun, with heavy packs on their backs, yet still they marched, carrying muskets, packs, and hopes of survival. They lived our lives on campaign, sleeping under the stars, carrying their world on their shoulders. So what did they eat? The standard ration was hardtack, a hard, dry cracker, and salt pork or beef, often rancid. Coffee was precious when available. Fresh food was rare. Soldiers sometimes bought chickens, tortillas, fruit, or pulque from locals when they could afford it. Water was always a problem. Wells and streams were often contaminated, leading to dysentery. Soldiers joked grimly that the real killer wasn't Mexican bullets, but the Mexican water. They were right. During the Mexican-American War, disease claimed far more lives than actual combat. In camp, daily life fell into a relentless routine. Reveille at dawn broke the silence, followed by roll call and long hours of drill under the unforgiving Mexican sun. Guards paced the perimeter while others cleaned their muskets, patch-worn uniforms, or wrote letters home on scraps of paper, when ink and energy could still be found. It was a life of discipline, repetition, and waiting, the quiet grind that filled the days between battles. Tents were scarce, especially for volunteers. Many men slept under blankets on the ground, exposed to rain or insects. Campfires were centers of life, where soldiers told stories, played cards, sang, and sometimes argued. Dysentery, malaria, measles, they killed thousands. Camps quickly became filthy, with human waste, animal carcasses, and poor drainage. Flies and mosquitoes were everywhere. Doctors did their best, but medicine was primitive. Quinine for malaria, calomel and bleeding for fevers. Treatments often made things worse. Soldiers nicknamed the surgeons sawbones and feared the hospital more than the battlefield. In order to keep things under control, the officers followed strict discipline rules, especially among regulars. A soldier could be flogged for drunkenness, desertion, or disobedience. Volunteers often resisted such harshness. In some occasions, they rebelled against unpopular officers. For many, alcohol was the only escape. Pulque, aguardiente, and whiskey were consumed in quantity, leading to fights, brawls, and more punishments. Desertion was common. Hundreds of American soldiers slipped away, some even joining the Mexican army, like the famous St. Patrick's Battalion. American soldiers lived in a foreign land, and their relations with Mexican civilians were complicated. Some bought food, traded, or even fell in love with local women. Others looted, stole, and abused the population, creating resentment and hatred. General Winfield Scott tried to enforce discipline and protect civilians during his march to Mexico City. But not all officers succeeded. Volunteers, in particular, were notorious for plundering towns. Morale swung between boredom and terror. Soldiers often wrote home about their misery, the heat, the filth, and the endless waiting. But they also spoke of pride, friendship, and the excitement of victory after long marches. For those who survived, war ended with a march back to the United States, often barefoot, half naked, and weakened by illness. The The Mexican-American War is remembered for its artillery duels, its cavalry charges, and the dramatic march to Mexico City. But at the heart of the American victory were the tactics of its infantry. Outnumbered, often fighting far from supply lines, the US infantry adapted old European methods to new terrain and rewrote the rules of battle. The American infantry relied on the classic Napoleonic tactic of fighting in line. 2 or 3 ranks of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, muskets leveled, waiting for the order to fire. At Buena Vista in February 1847, General Zachary Taylor's army was outnumbered at least 2-1 by Santana's Mexican forces. The US infantry held their ground in open fields, unleashing disciplined volleys into massed Mexican columns. Time after time, Mexican infantry advanced with bayonets and flags waving, only to be shattered by close-range fire. American lines bent but never broke, proving the value of steadiness and discipline under fire. The Americans also employed infantry squares, defensive battle formations designed to protect soldiers from enemy cavalry charges. During the Battle of Palo Alto, Mexican commander General Mariano Arista ordered General Torrejon's cavalry to strike the American right flank. In response, Colonel David E. Twiggs quickly formed the 5th Infantry into a defensive square. Muskets were leveled on all sides as the Mexican lancers charged through smoke and dust, only to meet a wall of steady American fire. The US Army understood that not every fight could be fought in rigid lines. The skirmishers, light infantry companies deployed ahead of the main force, harassed the enemy, picked off officers, and disrupted enemy formations. During the Battle of Resaca de la Palma on May 9, 1846, American infantry stormed through dense chaparral against entrenched Mexican troops. Visibility was low, the fighting close and desperate. American fire tore through the defenders, cutting down multiple enemies with every shot. Once the flanks were clear, the American center surged forward, overrunning the Mexican defenders and capturing their artillery. It was brutal but effective. Perhaps the most innovative adaptation of the American infantry tactics came in the cities of northern and central Mexico. Traditional European armies avoided urban combat, but the US soldiers had no choice. At Monterrey in September 1846, Mexican forces held strong defensive positions inside the city. At first, American assaults were repelled with heavy losses. Then, officers like William J. Ward realized that storming the streets was suicidal. Instead, infantry began fighting house to house, smashing through adobe walls, climbing rooftops, and advancing by breaching buildings instead of fighting on open streets. This method, brutal and exhausting, allowed the infantry to advance block by block until Monterrey fell. It was a glimpse of modern urban combat, decades ahead of its time. While frontal assaults won headlines, the real genius of American infantry tactics was the use of maneuver. Commanders like Winfield Scott preferred to avoid battering against strong defenses, instead sending infantry on long, difficult marches to strike the enemy's flank or rear. At Cerro Gordo on April 1847, the Mexicans fortified a mountain pass, believing it was impregnable. But Scott ordered his infantry to march around the cliffs, guided by engineers like Robert E. Lee. Exhausted but determined, the soldiers climbed steep ravines, dragging artillery by hand. When they attacked, they struck the Mexican army from behind, turning its defenses useless. In one day, an entire Mexican army was broken, and the road to Mexico City lay open. Though the musket was the infantry's main weapon, the bayonet still played a psychological role. Bayonet charges were rare, but when they came, they were decisive. At Molino del Rey in September 1847, American infantry advanced under withering fire to storm Mexican fortifications at the Old Mill. Casualties were horrific. Some units lost over half their men. But when the Americans finally closed, they drove the defenders out at bayonet point. The sight of advancing lines with gleaming steel fixed to their muskets was often enough to break the Mexican morale. Above all, American infantry tactics worked hand in hand with artillery. The US Army's light artillery was the best in the world, fast-moving, accurate, and deadly. This combination of disciplined infantry and mobile artillery became the signature of the American battlefield success. Yet, these tactics had their limits. The musket's short range forced the infantry to close dangerously near the enemy. American infantry overcame larger armies and strong defenses. In just 2 years, the infantry of the United States transformed from a small frontier garrison force into a battle-hardened army. By adapting linear firepower, skirmishing, flanking maneuvers, and even room-to-room fighting, they defeated a determined opponent and marched into Mexico's capital. Despite their hardships, the American infantry earned a reputation for toughness. Mexican armies often outnumbered them, but US troops fought with discipline, precision, and determination. The volunteers added ferocity, though their indiscipline sometimes led to looting, abuse of the local population, and numerous atrocities. The Mexican-American War forged the young officers who would later command in the Civil War: Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, George McClellan, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, and many others. They developed their combat skills as lieutenants and captains in Mexico, learning hard lessons about leadership, logistics, and combat that they would apply against each other just 15 years later.